Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. A lot of Star Wars fans like to think about what their lives would be like if they actually lived in the Star Wars galaxy. Unfortunately for 99.99999 of us, we're not going to be a Skywalker or a Solo or even Rey. And there's actually a really good chance that you won't be Force sensitive at all. Heck, you might even be reincarnated as some terrible Xeno like an Ewok or a Geonosian. But thankfully that's unlikely because humans are the most common species in the entire galaxy, and most of the populous races are near humanoid, which just basically means human but with different skin color or horns or head tentacles or something like that. So what is your lot in life going to be? The ideal situation is that you'll find a job that's a lot more fun and exciting than what you're doing here on Earth, right? But the reality is, most jobs in the Star Wars galaxy are also mundane as well. So today we're going to take a look at 5 of the most common industries in which people find employment in the Star Wars galaxy. Now in the Star Wars galaxy, you'll find some pretty massive supply chains, especially for essential items like foodstuff, especially food designed for carbon-based life forms. You had entire planets known as agri-worlds that were efficiently terraformed and built specifically to produce massive yields of various crops. Chandrilla, the home of Mon Mothma for instance, was an agricultural world. As was Protobranch, the homeworld of the B'val people. Their conversion to agriculture was so complete that they basically moved all of their cities into floating cities so they could save all that space on the ground for growing crops. Now, if you worked on a large planetary farming operation, you'll find a wide assortment of professions to fill, from marketing, sales, to logistics and transportation of goods. These large farms are most likely also monitored and maintained by a huge droid task force, so engineers, computer programmers, and maintenance crews will be important as well. Scientists and researchers will also be employed to make sure you're getting max crop yields and keeping disease and pests away from the goods. But the further you venture out to the outer edges of the galaxy, you'll see more small-scale operations, either small communes like the Felucian Nycillan farmers, or the homesteaders of the Outer Rim like the famous Tatooine moisture farmers, or the Urso family who owned a small plot of land on Lamu. The thing is, these smaller operations are only possible because large agricultural companies will not be willing to invest money in such remote areas where there's no security and no transportation. For a smaller operation to exist, you had to take a big risk and head out to these relatively dangerous areas. It's because of these various factors that most of the farmers who went out to these homesteads were subsistence farmers and made very little profit. Massive contracts like the Death Star or an executive-class Superstar Destroyer were considerable projects that required massive amounts of raw materials. And it all started out on mining worlds like Lothal and Mustafar. Now, more legitimate mining operations like the ones created to supply the shipping industry would utilize droids and other machines to speed up the process of mining. Of course, having the right mining equipment required a large investment that only bigger mining conglomerates like the ones in the Techno Union could afford. Some mining corporations would do deep space mining on asteroids or even attempt to extract volatile gases from planets and nebulas. In the Outer Rim, the regulations were not enforced as much, so slavery was actually quite common. The spice industry was famous for its cruel and harsh mining conditions. The Hutt clans and Pike Syndicate usually used slaves for the mining, processing, and refinement of these powerful narcotics. Although slavery was officially illegal, the Republic didn't have the necessary resources to enforce such laws. And with the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire, slavery became a much more common occurrence and was even used by the Imperial military to mine resources and build ships. Mining was a physically grueling job, and even with advancements in technology, drilling into the earth was still a dangerous profession. This usually led to a tough and short life full of hardship for the average miner. Darth Bane's father, for instance, was a Cortosis miner on a corporate-owned planet. He was extremely bitter and probably beat the dark side into Darth Bane. The Star Wars galaxy is full of all sorts of interesting vehicles, weapons, equipment, and droids, but they all have to be made somewhere, right? We talked a lot about the Techno Union in our previous video. This was one of the major industrial manufacturers in the galaxy, and they owned large operations in many parts of the Republic. While most of the factories and foundries used by the Techno Union were highly automated and featured very few organic workers, some planets like Corellia, which was famous for building small and medium-sized civilian ships, still utilized factory workers to build them. Han Solo's father, for instance, worked on the line for the Corellian Engineering Corporation's YT-1300 light freighter. During the Imperial era, we saw the Empire nationalize many of the shipbuilding companies and heavy industry companies. Palpatine wanted to drastically scale up the production of munitions, weapons, and warships to fit his military-first economic strategy. Instead of heavily automating these new large-scale factories, Palpatine opted to use cheap labor. He gave factory owners and corporations quotas to meet and huge financial incentives to remain under costs. At the same time, hyperinflation was caused by Palpatine's creation of a central bank from which he printed the credits necessary to fund his huge military expansion. So many industries that weren't subsidized by the government eventually had to collapse because of rising costs and rising wages. At the same time, consumers saw their own buying power weaken and entire lines of product that used to be affordable during the Republic era became luxury goods and in much higher demand. And so you had workers from many different professions lining up to get work in the only business that was open in town, that was usually the Empire's robust military-industrial complex. Still, conditions weren't good for the average Imperial factory worker, and because these factories were constructing war material, it was considered treasonous to refuse to come into work or organize oneself into a union. And factory owners were basically incentivized to use their security forces or even stormtroopers to essentially force obedience. And if you didn't do a good job, you would just be replaced. Eventually, Imperial factory workers even began sabotaging vehicles and equipment either to support the rebellion or just simply because they were unsatisfied by their job. It's not surprising that worker organizations like the Cobalt Laborers Reformation Front on the industrial world of Solus would join the rebellion once they reached their world. There are plenty of unhappy workers ready for change. We've talked about the Trade Federation in great deal and how they started out as an organization designed to protect small freight companies from mega conglomerates, but then eventually became the very evil they were supposed to protect the little guys from. Still, working as a pilot or a crew for a transportation vessel wasn't the worst job you could do, even if you were working for the corporos. I mean, much less risk was involved. You weren't piloting your own ship at this point. While the main hyperspace lanes were all pretty much saturated with these larger shipping companies where, career progression was limited, it was again in the Outer Rim where the private individual could make a decent living as a ship captain. Because as many ships as there were in the galaxy, there were never really enough to supply every remote outpost or colony. Being a ship pilot remained one of the last bastions for the sole proprietor who didn't want to kill people for a living. Although being a ship pilot in any area outside of the main hyperspace lanes did mean that you could run into pirates, space whales, or even worse. Buying a ship, of course, was no easy feat, especially a freighter large enough to fly through hyperspace. Oftentimes, prospective pilots would serve for years on freighters and transport vessels, saving up their credits to purchase their first secondhand ship. You also had a lot of military and security forces pilots retiring and then using their pension to basically buy a freighter so they could continue flying. Maintaining a ship and keeping it stocked and running well was a difficult task, but not having someone look over your shoulder and telling you what to do is priceless. The largest employer in the galaxy, even before the Emperor took over, was the federal government. Not even Emperor Palpatine's massive overhaul of the central government and evil Sith plans could get rid of the massive bureaucratic and administrative structures of the Republic. Legends say, just like the planet they were based on, Coruscant, the federal government had long forgotten what lay at the core of their bureaucratic and administrative machine. No one really understood why they were filling out all these forms and where they would eventually go to, but there was a general fear that if they stopped their jobs, the galaxy would just collapse. The Republic and the Empire's massive central government had long forgotten how its bureaucratic machine worked and could now only hope to continue maintaining and fixing it at a surface level. I mean, to work for the federal government in any capacity just meant a very mundane and safe and pointless life. You'd be able to afford a low-income residential unit on Coruscant and have some creature comforts, but your existence is just slavery, but with less obvious and more self-imposed limits. It's only those who were at the middle or high-level management positions that could truly earn a good living in these occupations, but only by leveraging whatever meager power they had to make some illicit funds on the side in the form of bribes. You can also find work if you're physically more capable as a soldier of the Empire. You could join the Imperial Navy or Army as a grunt, or if you're a bit more capable, join the Stormtrooper Corps. Those with an education and more importantly a fancy family name have the opportunity to join the Imperial Academy system and become an officer. The top tier cadets could even become bridge officers on a Star Destroyer or starfighter pilots. Not sure why so many people wanted to fly those disposable one-time use TIE fighters, but that was one of the most glorious and sought-after positions in his Emperor's Navy. Either way, whatever you do, try to avoid serving in the infantry. The military tech in Star Wars is too advanced for you not to be encased in several meters of Durasteel. So basically, if you lived in the Corps, guys, you'd be working for one of a handful of large corporations, or perhaps a criminal syndicate, or perhaps the federal government. If you want to be a sole proprietor, you gotta head out to the outer rim, to the emerging markets, where basically there's a lot of risk in doing business, but you can have a lot of reward as well. Well, guys, let me know in the comment section below what industry you prefer to work in, and also don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.